So I think we might get started, given we've got quite a bit to get through today. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today for our webinar focusing on safeguarding children and young people in sport and recreation. Before we begin today, I would like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting on today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today or who are viewing this webinar at a later date. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Patrice Fitzgerald, and I'm the Principal Lawyer and Director of Safe Space Legal. Safe Space Legal is a specialist law firm located in Melbourne, and we work with organisations across Australia exclusively in child safety and safeguarding. I have been a lawyer for over 17 years now, and the vast majority of my practice has been working in child safety and safeguarding, both as a lawyer providing services to clients and also working as an in-house lawyer. So I understand the challenges and complexities the organisations face in relation to safeguarding. I've worked with many survivors of child abuse and worked on countless matters in relation to current and historical allegations of abuse. And I know firsthand how important it is for organisations to get it right and minimise the risk of children being harmed. I am absolutely honoured to introduce you to Dr Mary Woessner, who has taken time out of her busy schedule today to co-present with me on this very important webinar. Mary is an early career researcher and lecturer within the Institute for Health and Sport at Victoria University. She leads innovative research, which I've been very much following over the last year or so, exploring sport and exercise enjoyment at an individual, institutional and societal level. Her work seeks to ensure that sport, from community to elite, is safe and enjoyable across the lifespan. She is a founding member of the International Research Network on Violence and Integrity in Sport, and she's also an active member of the Chair in Security and Integrity in Sport at Laval University in Canada. Mary, I understand it's been an exciting couple of months for you this week, releasing new research and also recently arriving back from London following the Global Sport International Conference and Research Symposium. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, finally back on track in terms of international datelines and all of that. But yeah, it's been really exciting, and I think an exciting time for the field of safe sport. That research symposium with Safe Sport International was the largest that's ever happened in history. 30 researchers, 90 attendees from 18 different countries. And I think it just speaks to the power of sport and also the community engagement and wanting to ensure that it's safe for everyone. So really excited to have the opportunity to speak to you all today, share some research and some insights from both our work here in Australia and internationally, and really start the conversation on an important topic.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. So from our perspective, this webinar will be partially legal in that's my role coming in from a legal perspective, but it's really great to hear from Mary as she's an expert in this and she's right at the forefront of current research in the area as well. So thank you, Mary. I also want to mention that the content we will be discussing today can be confronting and distressing, as we will be discussing harm against children. And should at any time you feel that the content is overwhelming or distressing, please feel free to take a break at any time. Support services are also listed on the screen. At any stage, if you'd like those support services sent out to you as well, we'd be happy to do so. So what are we going to be speaking to you about today? When I conduct child safety training, there are two fundamental goals that I like to get out of a session. Number one, obviously, I want people to walk away feeling that they've been upskilled in child safety, have a better understanding of risks and how those risks can be mitigated. And if things do go wrong within the organisation, more confident to respond appropriately and reduce further trauma on all those involved. And secondly, I want people to walk away and talk about child safety, bringing the dialogue back to their organisations, their workplaces, their homes, speaking to children who they're working with or children within their families, and have a conversation about child safety. Because as we know, speaking about child safety, speaking about the risks, mitigation strategies, encouraging reports and disclosures of harm to be made leads to a culture of child safety within the organisation. Today, we're joined by people from different organisations and across different states, from sporting and recreation organisations to organisations who offer different types of sporting and recreational services. We also know that many other people will be logging on to this webinar in their own time. So although the obligations that each person holds may be different, and may vary according to the state in which the organisation operates, the elements of safeguarding that I'll be going through today are relevant to each and every one of you. Before I launch into the current child safety landscape in Australia, which Mary is going to add to as well, I believe it's vital to take a look back on how we got here. And I've spoken to many survivors who gave evidence in the Royal Commission, and I'm a firm believer that the stories should not be forgotten. So rewinding nearly 9 years ago, on the 12th of November 2012, the Australian government announced that there would be a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Throughout the Royal Commission, over 42,000 phone calls were received, 25,964 letters and emails were received, over 8,000 private sessions were held, and 57 public hearings occurred. From this, 2,575 referrals were made to authorities, raising concerns for children being exposed to harm. The final report was released on the 15th of November 2017, which made 189 recommendations aimed at ensuring children and young people in the care, supervision and authority of organisations would be protected from harm. Specifically, recommendation 6.4 spoke to institutions must uphold the rights of a child, consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, and implement the child safe standards. The Royal Commission recommended that 10 child safe standards be implemented by organisations nationally, which I'll get to in a minute. Recommendation 6.10 and 6.11 require that an independent body oversees the implementation of the child safe standards and that the child safe standards support a reportable conduct scheme. So these are some of the recommendations that arose out of the Royal Commission final report. Of particular note, and what I want to talk to you about today is volume 14 of the Royal Commission final report, which specifically addresses child sexual abuse in sport, recreation, arts, culture, community and hobby groups. In the Royal Commission, 408 survivors gave evidence in relation to being sexually abused in sport and recreation. 74.8% were female and 65.5% of survivors told the Royal Commission that abuse first occurred between the ages of 10 to 14 years of age. 94% of survivors were abused by an adult. And some of the factors that the Royal Commission found contributed to abuse in sport and recreation included perpetrators using grooming strategies. For example, coaches exploiting their power and authority over a child in a coach-instructor relationship, the use of alcohol and other inappropriate activities as a form of grooming, and erosion of interpersonal boundaries. So one of the examples they used in the final report was a swimming instructor may be legitimately touching a student for the purposes of correcting a stroke, but that technique leading to inappropriate touching. And children and young people who were most vulnerable due to their own personal experiences were also targeted by perpetrators. And finally, valuing performance over child safety. On top of that, the Royal Commission found that societal and community cultures can also be risk factors of abuse. I know that Mary is going to speak about that a little bit more later, but it is important to understand that society's views on culture in sport can play an important role in mitigating risk. The Royal Commission found that children who had been harmed in sport and recreation activities had significant impacts on their wellbeing and development, including disengagement and loss of enthusiasm for their sport and recreation activity, isolation and impacts on their mental health and emotional health. And many survivors also face significant barriers to reporting their abuse, including a fear of not being believed, which in my experience is probably the most common barrier that's reported to me from survivors. Fear of the consequences, especially in a small, tight-knit community such as sporting organisations, feeling of shame and embarrassment, uncertainty about what is abuse and what is acceptable in a sport and recreation environment, and fear of the negative impacts on the future success in their sport and recreation activity. On average, the Royal Commission found that it takes approximately 23 years for a survivor of sexual abuse to make a disclosure. Now, today, when we're discussing sporting organisations, we're not just talking about elite athletes and national level competition, but every organisation offering sport and recreation programs to children and young people, including community sport groups, councils, schools, camps and religious institutions. I conduct many investigations of critical incidents in my role, and I've found that in practice that many of the concerns raised are in relation to staff members and volunteers who do provide those services of sport and recreation nature. So whether that be swimming instructors, music teachers, PE teachers, And all these factors I've just read out are applicable in those services as well, so not just in sporting organisations. Now, moving on, now we've sort of discussed some of the risk factors in sport and recreational organisations. It's really important to understand the legal obligations that organisations face, and I'll be speaking to that today. I'm going to move on to what you can do as an individual and what you can do as an organisation to ensure that children and young people are safe to participate. At Safe Space Legal, we have a motto that we go by: prevent, comply, respond. And we see that these are three vital steps that organisations and individuals should be taking to properly address safeguarding in their organisation. And by prevent, we mean, what are the preventative steps that organisations should take to identify and mitigate risks? By comply, we mean what legal and moral obligations exist and rest upon organisations and individuals, and what could they do to ensure that they're complying with those organisations? And by respond, we mean what steps does an organisation or individual within the organisation take to properly respond to critical incidents in a trauma-informed way in order to reduce further harm to the alleged victim and all the parties involved. These three steps, prevent, comply and respond, that we go by, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're a continuum. So if there's a critical incident, it's really important to go back to those preventative steps, go back to making sure you're complying with your legal obligations. And it's sort of a cycle that we talk about commonly with our clients. Moving on now, we're going to speak about legal obligations. Now, each of you sitting here listening to the webinar today, and each organisation will have different legal obligations, but it's important that you understand what those obligations are and make sure you're complying with them. As we have a broad audience today, I'm going to speak to you more generally about legal obligations. However, if in doubt, it's important to seek legal advice to understand your obligations and how they apply specifically to your organisation. So on the screen, you'll see some terms you've probably all heard before. And this is not an exclusive list of your organisational obligations, but you'll see duty of care, the national principles and the child safe standards, and reporting obligations. Organisations and their employees and volunteers within an organisation have a responsibility to protect children from harm. And the responsibility is referred to as duty of care. It's the duty of all employees and volunteers within an organisation to take reasonable steps to protect children in their care, supervision and authority from reasonably foreseeable harm. And when we talk about reasonably foreseeable harm, it means an employee or volunteer with sufficient knowledge, skills and information about safety and risk could understand that it is likely that without reasonable intervention, harm would be more likely than not to occur. So some of the reasonable steps that individuals or organisations may take to protect a child or young person in harm would be acting on concerns and suspicions of abuse as soon as practicable, seeking appropriate advice or consulting with other professionals or agencies when unsure of what steps to take, reporting child abuse to police or child protection or any other reporting obligations, which we'll go through in a minute, arranging and providing for ongoing support for the child, and information sharing when appropriate. An employee or volunteer would be in breach of their duty of care, and the organisation may be in breach of their duty of care if they fail to respond to an allegation of abuse in a situation where another employee or volunteer would have acted reasonably or diligently in the circumstances. And the same goes for risk mitigation as well. You do have a duty of care to make sure that you're mitigating risk of harm to children. The National Child Safe Principles, I'm sure everyone should be aware of, and if they're not, they're written up on the screen very briefly in a nutshell. The National Child Safe Principles were endorsed by members of the Council of Australian Governments in 2019, and they reflect the 10 child safe standards that were recommended by the Royal Commission. They provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding a culture of child safety in organisations that engage with children. And each state across Australia has endorsed the national principles, and some states have gone that step further to enact those national principles into legislation. So depending on what state you're in will depend on whether or not that legislation has been enacted. You need to ensure that you're complying with the national principles or the relevant state-based child safe standards. So for example, here in Victoria, the national principles are reflected in legislation under the Child Wellbeing and Safety Act as the child safe standards. And there currently are 11 child safe standards in Victoria. So there's one additional child safe standards in relation to cultural safety for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Other states have also enacted the principles into legislation or are in the process of doing so. In a nutshell, the national principles are that child safety and wellbeing is embedded in organisational leadership, governance and culture. Number two, that children and young people are informed about their rights, participate in decisions affecting them and are taken seriously. Families and communities are informed and involved in promoting child safety and wellbeing. Equity is upheld and the diverse needs of children are respected in policy and practice. People working with children and young people are suitable and supported to reflect child safety and wellbeing values in practice. Processes to respond to complaints and concerns are child-focused. Staff and volunteers are equipped with the knowledge, skills and awareness to keep children and young people safe through ongoing education and training. Physical and online environments promote safety and wellbeing while minimising the opportunity for children and young people to be harmed. Implementation of the National Child Safe Principles is regularly reviewed and improved, and policies and procedures document how the organisation is safe for children and young people. From the Royal Commission came a number of other recommendations in relation to reporting obligations to ensure that timely, appropriate and consistent responses could occur in instances where child abuse is alleged. Once again, depending on the state that you live in and the state that your organisation operates within will depend on what your reporting obligations are and how they apply to your organisation. Some states have enacted criminal offences for failing to disclose child sexual abuse and failing to respond to child sexual abuse. So, for example, in Victoria, we have section 327, subsection 2 of the Crimes Act, which is a failure to disclose offence. And we also have section 49.0, subsection 1, that if a person of power or responsibility within an organisation is aware that a child may become a victim of a sexual offence by an adult associated with the organisation and negligently fails to remove or reduce that risk, then that person may have committed an offence. Mandatory reporting obligations also differ across different states. So each state has a different category of professionals who are mandated to report to the relevant state-based child protection or child services department any concerns relating to children who are at risk or in need of protection. And depending on the state, some of the professional categories may include doctors, nurses, midwives, registered teachers and early childhood teachers, school counsellors, police officers, early childhood workers. That's just some religious ministers. There are also provisions in legislation which, once again, depending on the state that you're operating within, in relation to voluntary reporting and making reports in good faith if any person believes a child is at risk or in need of protection. Some states have also enacted the reportable conduct scheme, which I touched on before, and that was a recommendation of the Royal Commission. Once again, each scheme differs, but if your organisation falls within the mandate of a reportable conduct scheme, then it must comply. And in a nutshell, that means if an organisation becomes aware that an allegation has been made against an employee or volunteer of the organisation, then this allegation must be reported to the government regulator and properly investigated. At Safe Space Legal, we support many organisations through this process, which can be a particularly stressful process for all parties involved. And we conduct those independent investigations as it does require specific expertise, especially in relation to interviewing children about the concerns that were raised. But the reportable conduct scheme does not necessarily apply to all organisations. And from a sporting context, the mandate for reporting some allegations is to actually the Sport Integrity Australia, which I'll speak about next. So Sport Integrity Australia has developed the National Integrity Framework, which I'm sure some of you may have heard of if you're working within a sporting organisation. And that recognises the need for a consistent and overarching framework across all sports to identify any conduct that threatens the integrity of the sport. And that includes child abuse and neglect, misconduct and sexual harassment. And as part of the framework, Sport Integrity Australia has developed a suite of policies, including a safeguarding children and young people policy, member protection policy and complaints, disputes and discipline policy. Since the framework has been rolled out since 2021, there's been over 80 national sporting organisations who have adopted the framework. Sport Integrity Australia have also developed the Safeguarding in Sport Continuous Improvement Program with an objective to embed a culture of child safety and member protection across all levels of sport. An integrity complaint can be made to Sport Integrity Australia regarding a child safety issue. However, to be eligible, the sport must have adopted the National Integrity Framework. The alleged prohibited conduct must have occurred after the sport's adoption of the National Integrity Framework. The matter must relate to child's safeguarding policy or discrimination. You must be the alleged affected party or parent or guardian of the alleged affected party. And the alleged offender must be bound by the sport's policies. And you must be willing to give contact details, as complaints cannot be made anonymously. So just as a side note, the criteria for a complaint to Sport Integrity Australia does differ to complaints made under the reportable conduct scheme. And one of the best examples of that is under the reportable conduct scheme, if your organisation does fall within that scheme, is that allegations can be made anonymously, and they need not be made by the affected party or the parent. It can be made by anybody, any person who forms a reasonable belief. So it's important to know, number one, whether your organisation falls under a reportable conduct scheme. If not, does it fall under the mandate of Sport Integrity Australia? And make sure that you're following the appropriate processes. Sport Integrity Australia's resources and programs are aimed at national sporting obligations, and while they can be useful reference, they may not be accessible in a community sporting context. And this is where Play by the Rules comes in. Play by the Rules is a collaboration between Sport Integrity Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission, State and Territory Departments of Sports and Recreation, and State and Territory Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights Agencies, the Office of the Children's Guardian, and the Anti-Discrimination Board of Australia, which provides free resources and training to sporting organisations of all levels across Australia. And Play by the Rules aims to upskill members in all positions of sporting organisations, including coaches, players, parents, administrators, and to try and build capacity to prevent and combat misconduct in sport. Play by the Rules does offer general advice on their website on a range of issues, including child safety issues. And there's some template policies there which can be really helpful, especially if you're working within a smaller organisation which may not have the budget to try and seek legal advice to have your templates, to have your policies developed. There's certainly some great templates on board on their website. There's also an e-learning hub open to all members of the public, and free training is available as well on sports, for sports organisations. Now, for those people who are attending today who are not a sporting club as such, but do offer sporting services, you may also wish to have a look at the resources provided by Play by the Rules, because there's some really great ones there. So we've spoken about the legal obligations and resources available to you in your organisation to create a child-safe environment. And now I'm going to throw over to Mary to talk more specifically about her current research and some of the things that she's seeing in her role.
Thank you for that, and always good to have that overall legal framework as well. And I think one of the things, just before I go into my bit here, to highlight is, as clear as some of the legal elements are, there's still a lot of grey, especially in the sport and recreation sector, especially with regards to Sport Integrity Australia. There are so many ifs, ands, or buts, and ways around the system that it's really complicated. And I think as well, from a historical context, knowing that a lot of the initiatives we have now came from the institutional responses to child sexual abuse, there's an extensive focus on child sexual abuse. And while that is good, while that is positive, while it is needed, there is a lack of focus on all the other types of abuse that can be commonplace in many institutions as well as in sport. So that's where a lot of the gray area comes in too. Because the reality is, unless it's child sexual abuse or something that is reportable conduct under various legal schemes, it's going to come back down to your individual organization's policies as to what can be done. Oftentimes you'll be kicked back all the way down to think, what do we need to do on a day-to-day basis to protect these kids from different types of abuse? And that's kind of the gray area that our research speaks to. And also hopefully that provides a little context into the legal frameworks too. So when we look at the overall picture of abuse in sport, you know, to one extent, it's the same as other contexts, right? Like any institution, there's power, there are hierarchies, there's a competition innate in various industries. But there are also a lot of unique elements to sport. Sport is historically violent in nature. That's how it was founded. It started with battles, quite literally. Some of the first questions we get when we present our research on violence or abuse in sport is, but isn't sport violent by nature? How do you define violence in and of itself? So we'll speak about that because there are some very clear guidances to what constitutes violence. But there's a level that we've also accepted in sport, a normalization of specific types of violence under the guise of it will increase performance. And our team has released different conversation pieces over the last week that speak to how controlling behaviors, how authoritarian styles by coaches, by parents, are kind of excused, rationalized, or normalized in sport with the idea that it actually helps increase performance. There's actually no data to support that. In fact, a lot of data supports the opposite, that autonomy, supportive style coaching or parenting can lead to better health outcomes, and in sport, better performance outcomes. So there are all these different contexts that we have in and around the sporting environment. And a lot of it comes down to, for too long, we have normalized abusive practices in the name of performance outcomes. And this happens at the community level as well. Next slide, Patrice. So I spoke a little bit about the unique context. Some of these are unique only in their presentations, not necessarily in their innate characteristics. So power imbalances also happen in other institutional contexts. But the physicality of sport does create some unique environments. And Patrice gave a great example earlier of, touching or instructional purposes for skill development in various sporting contexts. But there's also just the physicality of the sport itself. Players can shove each other on the field, and in certain instances it's okay, and in others it's not. Coaches throwing things on the field, either towards or around players, can be normalized. Maybe in today's world we would flinch a little bit if we saw it, but you probably still wouldn't say something, or most people wouldn't. But if that were to happen in an education environment, with a teacher throwing a book towards a child that was being a little too boisterous, absolutely unacceptable. So that kind of speaks to that normalization element of what's happening in and around sport versus other contexts. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us, is talking about those pieces that have been normalized. Next slide. When we talk about types of abuse, child sexual abuse manifests in very similar ways across institutional contexts. So in that regard, sport as another sector within that institutional response document, very incredibly relevant. But what we haven't really gone into are all those other areas. And I'm not going to say they're gray areas, because to me, I think they're still quite clear. And if we saw those behaviors in other contexts, it would be quite clear to everyone else. But in sport, again, somewhat normalized. So when we talk about abuse or violence in sport, we're talking about behaviors that can include psychological violence, physical violence, neglect, as well as sexual. And how those manifest in sport might look a little bit different than other contexts. For example, we know that overtraining to the point where a person is vomiting or purely exhausted, asking a child to train beyond their physical capabilities or skill level, forcing children to play while they are injured against medical advice. All of those things are types of violence or abuse against children in sport. They just might not be as easily recognized by the child or the parents or even the sport club members. So those are the things that we really have to start thinking about. And for a broader context, in our research that we released last year, 82% of the respondents had experienced at least one form of violence during their community sport participation as a child. So only 18% out of the 900 respondents had never experienced anything. The highest rates were experiences from other peer athletes, but coaches had over 50% psychological or physical violence, and the rates are quite alarming overall. We saw high rates of being forced to train against medical advice. When we did interviews with people, we heard those stories. And to Patrice's point, it's really important to center the voices of survivors and victims of abuse in various contexts. And in sport, we try and do that as well. We were hearing from people that have lifelong injuries because they were forced to play in a grand final because their coach wanted them to, whose parents convinced them to keep going in a sport where they were being very much verbally harassed by their peers, by coaches. We've also heard about the role of parents as spectators, pushing kids too hard. I think a real challenge as well is differentiating between what is kind of that tough love coaching mentality and what actually constitutes abuse. I get this question a lot, and we'll speak a little bit more to this later, but I think it is important to think anytime you have that feeling where something is happening, I think most of the time we have that sense in ourselves that, oh, that doesn't feel quite right. We just don't know what to do with that feeling. Is it bad enough? Should I say something? Who do I say something to? Does this meet the standard of being bad enough? So if we as adults are having that gut reaction and not knowing what to do next, that kind of spells a big problem for the children that are experiencing it, for the children that are witnessing it. And I think we also need to think about what our silence says to those kids. We were hearing from people in that frequencies of violence study a lot that were saying, well, my parents saw the abuse happening. They saw the coach throwing things at us. They saw the coach criticizing us, yelling at us, humiliating us, and said nothing. So that made us think that it was okay. And when you hear that, it's like, whew, all right, that's our call to action. That's when we need to step in and say something. Next slide. Our recent study that we've just released this week was focused on disclosures of abuse. So we went back to those individuals who had said, yes, I've experienced abuse in sport as a child at community sport level in Australia. And we asked, did you ever speak to someone about that? And we pre-prescribed the someone as being an adult. So we asked if they spoke to an adult, and if so, which adult? And then how did that interaction unfold? We found that less than half had ever talked to an adult about any experience of abuse in sport. That's really problematic. That means we're not even hearing about half of the instances, and the number of those that actually went on to any sort of formal report, disastrously low. What we also saw is when the abuse was carried out by a coach or a parent, we only saw about 1 in 4 kids would come to an adult, or for parents, about 1 in 9. Those are really low rates, and it means even what we do know is probably vastly underrepresenting what is actually happening out there. And when we spoke to them about why they weren't coming forward or what experience they had in those few instances where they did, you hear a lot of this. And again, this is at the community sport level, but this idea of, I didn't want to risk losing my sport. My sport is my whole life. If I said something, what would happen? If I said something, what would happen to the person I'm reporting? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm mistaken? What if this doesn't count? A lot of, is this bad enough? And for those few that did think, okay, this is bad enough, or this has happened long enough, I need to say something, when they did go to an adult, usually a parent, the response they had was mostly around normalizing, rationalizing, or even dismissing those concerns. And on the parent side, I want to put a caveat in here, because I think there's a level of, the children very rarely came forward and said, I'm experiencing abuse in sport from my coach, please help me. They didn't have those words. They would say things like, I'm not enjoying sport. I didn't have fun today. I don't know that I want to go to practice. And then it was up to the parents to kind of dig into it. But even when they became quite explicit with what they were experiencing, parents were still normalizing that back to them. Coaches throwing things, peers bullying them. Oftentimes parents were giving feedback to the child saying, well, that's what I experienced too. That's just a part of sport. Buck up, try again, keep going. In the short term, actually, it has somewhat of a positive effect on the child, right? Because anytime we experience something that's quite negative, if someone else normalizes or says it's not as bad as you think it is, oftentimes we'll immediately feel a little bit better. Okay, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. Maybe it's okay. All right, I was just overreacting. I feel better. In the long term, though, the consequences of sending that child back into that sporting environment where they're experiencing abuse can be extremely detrimental and have severe consequences. And from a safe sport perspective, they're not actually changing anything. So nothing is progressing to a formal report. No one is alerted beyond that parent and that child. And the abuse cycle can continue, not just for that child, but for other people in the sport too. So there are a few knock-on effects that we're seeing from that. And I think it's not just saying, oh, parents aren't listening, you need to do better. It's also recognizing that parents have grown up in a system as well, that potentially they've experienced abuse, and potentially that abuse has been normalized as well. So I would argue that a safe system in sport is not just one in which all abuse is prevented, because that's probably not realistic in a holistic sense. But we do want to hear from people. It takes on average 20 plus years for a child to speak about child sexual abuse, which means right now we're only just hearing about what happened 20 years ago. A safe system is one in which we're hearing things that are happening right now. And hopefully it's not all the way to the point of child sexual abuse. Hopefully we're catching grooming behaviors. Hopefully we're catching bullying. But another point is there's often a hierarchy placed on these experiences of abuse. And the reality of the literature is that psychological violence, even just 1 or 2 instances against a child in a particular context, can absolutely have the same lifelong impacts on mental well-being as sexual abuse. So we put this hierarchy in place because we have this perception that one is a lot worse and arguably should be addressed first. But the reality is it really depends on the child as to how an individual experience impacts them. And that's really important too. Next slide. So as Patrice shared, I just got back from Safe Sport International. And like I said, it was one of the largest conferences to date. And from a research perspective, again, we had over 90 people in attendance at a full day research symposium, which our team coordinated. It was impressive. We had a lot of Australian representation, Sport Integrity Australia individuals were there as well. And I think that shows a broader commitment to this space, an uptick in the research, a value in this space. But I will say overall, what I found was there's still a lot of focus in the elite context. And while that is important, of course, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that 99.9% of people will forever stay at the community non-elite level. And 100% of people who played sport at one point played at the community level. So when we think about Australia as being such a sporting nation and we have such high participation in sport, and we also think about what age children drop out of sport, that 14, 15-year-old, we can kind of start thinking, what's happening at that age? And what we know broadly from other literature in sport in Australia is that that's where competition really starts to increase. Girls especially are dropping out at age 14, 15. The bullying, psychological abuse, the controlling behaviors by coaches and parents, all of that really kicking off. And in some sports, it starts as young as 5 and 6, depending on the age of competition and the pathway. So I'm really positive about the field overall. I think it is growing massively. There is a lot of focus still on sexual abuse at the exclusion of the other types of violence. And I think a lot of the gray area in sport is becoming less and less in the child sexual abuse area. I'm not saying we're great at still recognizing all the grooming behaviors, but I would say that there's a lot more legal framework for those child sexual abuse cases. And there's a lot more gray and responsibility for all the other types of abuse. And that is all true, very much so at the community sport level, where the majority of people are volunteer-based. The majority of people are playing multiple roles. They're a parent, they're a coach, maybe they're also supporting the management of the team, maybe they're on the board of directors. So when we look at the community sport context, I think there is a lot more to unpack, and there's a lot more complexity in terms of getting the education and information out there to help people make the informed decisions. Thanks, Patrice.
Thank you, Mary. It's very insightful, and it is exciting when we look at the positivity of what's coming out of that research. And I suppose from our perspective as well, is what we are seeing more and more is that allegations are being made at an earlier stage. So what I'm seeing in my sort of investigation side of things is often allegations are being made about grooming or sexual misconduct. It's sort of a wider breadth of what we're looking at. And we are starting to see that they're and this is, as I said, from my perspective, we are starting to see that these allegations have been made earlier so that we're not seeing that very harmful behaviour, I hope, further down the track, but we are trying to stop it before it gets to that stage. So I think that's a real a positive thing that this research is helping so much in safeguarding. And the other thing I wanted to focus on is I don't want this webinar just to be the doom and gloom of child safety. And that's what we're going to go into now is sort of what tips can sporting organisations, what tips do we have for you to try and improve safeguarding within your capacity? And you need to shift the approach from sort of the minimum legal compliance to best practice in our view. So obviously compliance is an important concept, but it's best to look at best practice and not just what do we need to do, but what should we be doing to make child safety better within our organisation. And the number one thing that we do know is that if you take a top-down and bottom-up approach, everyone is responsible for child safety. Within an organisation, you will start to create that culture of child safety. And to do this, we need to consider some of the risk mitigation strategies and how to build a culture of child safety within the organisation. And I've tried to set out a few tips here. Obviously, given the limited time that we have, I've only been able to set out some. But one of the most important things an organisation can do, and whether that be you're a sporting organisation or some other organisation offering sporting and recreation services or any services to children, is to have a robust, clear and accessible child safety policies, procedures and code of conduct, which are implemented across the organisation. So prior to developing your policy suite, you really should go through a process of identifying what risks exist within your organisation and thinking about how those risks could be mitigated through the use of policies and procedures. And then you need to draft the policies and procedures and make sure that they're implemented, making sure that your staff, your volunteers, the children and young people and their families are all aware and can access the policies and procedures. So some of the common policies that we draft at Safe Space Legal are, your child safety policy, which sets out the roles and responsibilities of each person within the organisation and other aspects of child safety. A child safety reporting procedure is extremely important, so people know how to respond if there is a critical incident. It doesn't matter how good your organisation is and how effective it is in risk mitigation. Unfortunately, there are still times where child safety allegations will be made, concerns will be raised, and you need to know how to respond to those appropriately, both in a legal, fulfilling your legal and your moral obligations. Some of the other things that we see sort of more in a sporting context or in services that do have sport and recreation services are professional boundaries policies. So really speaking to, as Mary mentioned before, a lot of the concerns we look at is, you do have your black and white, which is quite clear, but there's a lot of grey. And if you can have a policy that addresses some of that grey, that makes it very discreet, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So for instance, a professional boundary policy that really talks about the boundaries in relationships, the appropriateness of physical contact in sport, when it is okay, when it's not okay, what you should do before you make physical contact with a child and young person. Another one we see often is photography policy. You might have children within your organisation who have family court orders or have some other sorts of intervention orders or may for other reasons not want their photographs published publicly. So it's really important to understand in your organisation what is acceptable from a photography perspective. Another one that I've seen often is transporting children and young people. You'd be surprised how many times children and young people are still being transported one-on-one with coaches or with other people within an organisation. And a policy in and around mitigating risk of harm to those children in that one-on-one setting is really important. Another important one is the racism and anti-discrimination policy. So having a policy in place about zero tolerance for bullying and abuse. Recruitment policy is so vital in an organisation, making sure that you are hiring or you are having volunteers who are suitable to work with children and young people. A real robust policy. Unfortunately, working with children checks are not enough. Working with children checks only pick up criminal offences, and in some states, they may consider reportable conduct investigations or disciplinary investigations, but even then it is still quite limited. You need to have a robust recruitment policy where you're checking referees, where you're letting people know that you have a culture of child safety and you're dedicated to your commitment of child safety, where you're checking with referees and asking questions of someone who has applied for a position in your organisation and making sure that they are suitable to work with children and young people. Often you'll find that organisations who have a really strong recruitment policy, perpetrators may try to avoid those sorts of organisations if they know they're not going to get away with it within that organisation. So even having that really strong recruitment policy at the outset is really important. A clear complaints handling procedure so that any child, person, family member knows who to make a complaint to and what will happen when that complaint is made. But one of the most important documents that I see in my work as being especially important is a child safety code of conduct. And that be for staff and employees and volunteers to really set out what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behaviour of those people. And organisations may also want to consider having a child safety code of conduct for their children and young people who are also involved in the sport to mitigate the risk of peer-on-peer harm as well. Now, having a nice, robust policy suite means nothing if you're not implementing those policies throughout the organisation and implementing them consistently. Policies have to be implemented to be effective. Staff must be aware of them and trained about them. So yearly and pre-season orientation and recapping of these policies, re-signing your code of conduct with membership renewals, really important steps that can help people refresh on what is required of them. I was also going to suggest that in organisations which have a culturally diverse population, you may also want to consider having your policies translated into so that it's accessible to all people. And for organisations who have young children or children with disability, organisations should also consider having their policies as easy to read so that they're also accessible to all as well. So that's just some of our tips moving forward on how you can start looking at implementing a real child-safe culture within your organisation, regardless of whether you're at elite level, community sport, or whether you're at some other service that also offers these sort of sporting and recreation or services. But what I want to move on to now is, I suppose, we have this wonderful Mary who's here today to provide insight into the research and the current research in around safeguarding in sport and recreation. And I'm going to move to asking Mary some questions about that. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask Mary or myself, please feel free to also put it in the chat. And if we don't get to it today because of time, we can always come back to you on that. So I've been brainstorming, Mary, some questions about what to ask you, because there's so much that I'd love to ask you and hear about. And I think it could be a whole nother 2-hour webinar. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, currently based on your research, what do you think the biggest challenges are for the sporting community at the moment in regards to their safeguarding capacity?
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for the overall presentation. I think normalization of abusive practices is the continued biggest risk we have because it's unaddressed. So I think we're making a lot of strides in terms of addressing and responding to child sexual abuse, but I think it becomes a little too easy, or I hesitate with saying the word easy, but it becomes a little bit easier to comprehend that there could be a single predator in and amongst the midst around us going after children. And we can conceptualize that, and we can other that, and we can say we're looking out for that. It's a lot harder to start to unpack our own behaviors and practices that we've normalized for so long as coaches, when we're being overly critical, when we think that we're yelling at someone to get their best. Those types of practices become a lot harder to unpick. And we think that we'll have some clarity when we see someone doing something, or we'll be able to pick the bad people out. But the truth is that there's just a lot of normalization that's happened in the sporting context. And the best way I can describe it is, I don't know if anyone else has done this, but if you've ever gone back and watched comedy shows from 10, 20 years ago with today's eyes, how many cringe moments have you had at the humor that was used then that was acceptable, that is no longer acceptable now? And you go, ooh, should I even be watching this? We need to somehow get to the point where we do that when we're watching sport, where we don't say, well, that's how it's always been done, or that's just what it is, or that's how you coach, or that. We need to have today's lens and go, that's not okay. And then we need to be ready to act on it. So I think having everyone as a community not being scared to call out or speak about those behaviors is our biggest challenge, because these things thrive in the shadows. So the more we can speak about it, the more we can actually start to prevent these behaviors from happening. We don't want the person coming forward being the one lone person speaking up. We want everyone to go, hey, that's not on. We don't want that in our club. And while a lot of sports think that this type of kind of approach might actually push away volunteers, no one wants to come in if they're going to be at risk of being called abusive, I actually think it's the opposite. There's no evidence to suggest that that would happen, but I actually think a lot of people actually want to work in safe environments. They want their kids to be in safe environments, and clubs or organizations that put that at the forefront could actually benefit from having more volunteers and more involvement and investment in their sport.
Thanks, Mary. It's very interesting, isn't it, hearing that normalization of abuse, because you don't really hear it in any other sector. I'm trying to think of any other sector where we would hear that abuse is normalized. And as you said before, in the context of a school classroom, if a student was to have a book thrown at them, it wouldn't be acceptable, but somehow it is acceptable in sporting context. So it's very interesting. We often hear comments such as, but you get the best results by being tough. What do you say to comments such as those?
There's no evidence to support that. There's not been a single research study that has shown that abusive practices actually produce higher performance outcomes. There are heaps of studies in and outside the sports sector that say there are long-term consequences to the child in those instances. This idea that a tough love approach produces better athletes or better children, this idea that resilience is key and sports responsibility is to teach that to children, there's no evidence to say that that actually produces better outcomes. And in fact, we know from kids, for the first time, there was a study done this year, not ours, but it's supported by the International Olympic Committee, where youth, I think the ages were 14 to 17, but something around, it's still children under 18, sharing why they didn't want to get into sport. And for the first time, we're seeing data where they're saying, because I fear physical abuse, because I fear verbal abuse. And when children are saying that, that's got to be something that we listen to. When they're actually scared to come into sport because of that, that should be a big concern. So when we think about what we mean, don't say tough love coaching. Let's say humiliating. Let's say neglecting children. Let's say being overly critical. Let's say forcing children to play against medical advice. Let's use the language that we're actually talking about, because tough love kind of covers that up with a nice little key phrase that everyone can kind of go, yeah, we need to be tough. But that's not actually what we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I know that I spoke previously about disclosure rates coming out of the Royal Commission, and we both said, you know, it takes on average 23 years for a person to make disclosure of sexual abuse. However, as you said, you know, it's wider than this. It's wider than sexual abuse and what's been covered off by the Royal Commission. In your experience and in your research, why do you believe that disclosure rates are so low?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge that our survey wasn't representative in nature. So we can't say like overall for sport, these are the disclosure rates. We actually need a lot more funding to be able to do a representative study as big as some of the other national projects. But there hasn't been one in sport specifically, and that's unfortunate. What we see in sport again is that sport becomes a pseudo family. There's actually research that talks about sport as a family unit almost, and children are scared to lose that in similar ways that they're scared to speak about domestic violence, in similar ways to they're scared to being speaking out about church. There's also them not wanting to lose sport as a competition. If they're wanting to kind of go up in the field, there's a huge risk in coming forward. It's why we see a lot of elite athletes coming forward after they've retired, and very few speaking up about abuse while they're in the system. We've seen a few cases where elite athletes are starting to come forward and say, nope, my mental health isn't well. I need to step out of this. I need to leave the environment. But more often than not, we hear about that after their career is over. And I think, again, that speaks to there's this silencing nature. There's you know, we need to protect our own. We need to keep sport in-house. And there's been a historical nature in sport being viewed as almost a separate institution from the rest of society. And in fact, one of our biggest challenges in the research that we do is advocating for sport to be considered alongside those other institutional contexts, because sport often works in its own little bubble, in its own silo. And we really actually need to interlink it with these other institutions so that's considered under the same umbrella as it should be.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who did attend today or who is listening to this webinar at a later date. I am conscious of the time, so I am going to have to bring it to a close. All of those people who have registered, we have developed a resource which we will be emailing out in the next couple of days, which will hopefully provide some of the things that we've talked about today and touch on some of these issues in relation to sport and safeguarding in sport, and also to provide some sort of tips moving forward. Once again, you know, we really want to focus on what positive steps organisations can take in order to keep children and young people safe in a sporting environment. And we're incredibly grateful for people attending today. If you have any questions, we have run out of time now, but if you have got any questions, please feel free to send us an email, either to myself, and I can forward it on to Mary or directly to Mary as well. And we would be grateful to answer any questions that you had coming out of today's session. There's obviously a lot to comprehend and process after today. I found it quite insightful, Mary, listening to you and all your research that you have. And I'm once again very grateful for you taking the time out today. And thank you to everyone for attending. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.